Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure there are people in the room, but we're ready to conclude the conference. And I'm just wondering whether we can switch on videos so that we can at least have some interaction in the closing session. So I really want this to be an engagement rather than me speaking as the closing the conference. So I can't see any videos on yet, but I'd be really happy to see some faces. All right, so maybe just to start off by saying a huge thank you to every one of you. I was just so inspired by the many discussions, just the panel discussion that we had now. Really speaks to the investment in teaching and learning and seeing teaching and learning as a humanizing space. I think the significant shift that we've seen in how engagement is happening and the care and empathy that we see every day is really very encouraging. So I do want to thank you all for participating, for presenting, for interacting, for asking difficult questions. I want to say a special thank you to Dr. Mayasela and Dr. Walji, and to everybody really who has worked extremely hard to bring this conference together. I also want to say a huge thank you to Associate Professor Kasturi Bihari Leek, the Chair Dean, for shaping the conference and offering critical reflections on how we can reimagine the educational project. So, there were several issues raised during the course of this conference. And I'm wondering if, as we go through and as I reflect, if you too could join me and keep this as participatory as we can. So in the chat, if you could reflect on what were your takeaway points and what were the issues that came up for you during the course of this conference. It would really help us, I think, to create a community of practice moving forward, that this is really not the end, but the continuation of our conversations around teaching and learning. So please chat as I present some of my reflections as well. One of the key points that were raised around decolonizing curriculum is the importance of decolonizing curriculum for where we are now in this critical time at our university. But also what I read into that was the frustration with the slow pace of change. The speaker spoke intently throughout the conference on the importance of centering African languages in education, on the need for deep engagement with knowledge generation, its epistemology, ontology, methodology, and how we should think inclusively, be disability conscious in all of our teaching and learning to be proactive. But I also want to say that despite that slow pace of change or the frustration we may feel, there is a sense of the gains that we are making. And many of the projects have spoken to just how the practice of decolonizing curriculum is really in the everyday spaces of teaching and learning. Whether we call it decolonization perhaps is a question we want to ask. But I think in so much of what I heard, I see the implementation, and perhaps that's something we really should celebrate. We also saw it in the descriptions of some of the projects. So for example, the undergraduate social responsiveness project, which uses a decolonial approach to curriculum change, the practice-based transdisciplinary approach to decolonizing curriculum in health and rehabilitation sciences, excuse me, was also showed us many examples of what could be done practically. We also heard about decolonial pedagogies in occupational therapy curriculum, using the community development practice, decolonial arts-based research methods, and we benefited from hearing and really understanding indigenous games in Africa available on open resources to decolonize curriculum. One of the areas that really came out or was very powerfully situated was the power of stories as a pedagogical approach, and that came through many, many presentations as an active way to decolonize curriculum. Revisiting and changing the architecture of digital learning portals, critical reflections on decentering whiteness are among the many, many topics that we've heard discussion around. And Msaka, I think, really energized the panel discussions with very incisive questions on decolonizing higher education and the importance of continuing to engage those questions. They're difficult, but they are necessary. Our guest speaker this morning, Professor Mpini Moko, strengthened the case for decolonizing curriculum and inspired us by talking about the critical importance of preparing young people for the future, for education that is in service of public good. Education, she reminded us, was broad-based and not limited to institutional spaces. And we see the value of anticipatory methodology as we reimagine desirable futures and understand that the focus on education is indeed a systemic focus from grade R and perhaps even earlier. The conference also brought to light, in my mind, just the importance of how we're working currently and the importance of our collaborative practices and collective responsibilities. For example, in all of the panel discussions, we saw how people work together in the design of curriculum, in the implementation, and particularly in the different methods, particularly in the blended learning space. We also saw the importance of bringing disciplines together. So whether it was maths and educational practices, as we heard in the MAM curriculum, it just said that we working as a broader transdisciplinary university community, and that was key to our success. We've also noted that tutors play a key role in the teaching and learning space. And what I really appreciated was just the investment in engaging students, in finding students and creating methodologies that show what and really bring to life actually what a safe space for learning can be about. And where we are now is really about thinking about how we integrate the academic project, create systemic support for tutors so that we can continue to build a community of practice. In the student domain, I think we've seen extensive engagement with a variety of student issues, among them student mental health, academic performance of students during COVID, which continues to remind us of which students are most vulnerable. And perhaps it is one of the conversations that we really need to talk about far more, because as much as we've talked about pedagogy, we've talked about engagement, it is really also talking about vulnerability and throughput of students. And that's certainly worth a continuing conversation. The continued dialogue on RPL reminds us that what we've achieved is indeed very important in the transformation of UCT, and that there's still more to do. Excuse me. Students as partners and co-creating with students in an engagement space, where students own and really participate in a meaningful way, came through in various presentations and panels. And it was really inspiring to hear about methodology that the academic leadership academy is using. The equity by design concept to generate humanness of students as leaders, I think, is such a critical learning for us all. In health sciences, the questions have been raised about whether we want students to be change agents. And I think this is not limited to health sciences, it's actually across the university. And therefore, whether we should be considering leadership coaching across all programs and what this would mean for curriculum and curriculum change. In the domain of staff, we see discussions around the academic teaching pathway and asking about what opportunities are there for career progression, for staff who excel in teaching. The experiences of lecturers also during COVID brought to light some of the challenges and the importance of us balancing student and staff well-being in the teaching and learning space. Although the conference spoke a lot to the engagement and pedagogy, I think where we still need to build on is in the area of assessment. So we had heard a bit about assessment, but it requires extensive deliberation because the changing of our pedagogy, of our educational philosophy, must then also translate into into assessment. And that's certainly something that I think would be a further focus as we move on. In the domain of blended learning, I think we've just heard, how much innovation there's been, and the inclusion of UDL also, brings to light that actually it's about engaging student learning and using technology to bring a humanity into the learning space and to privilege. That means that we're not just focusing on technology, but really focusing on how technology affords us the opportunity to humanize learning. We've also talked about the many ways in which we can think about inclusivity in the blended learning space and how we've had to transition to courses with blended learning, but how much better we've become at that. I really enjoyed the point around softening the online engagement, because this is certainly very difficult to do. And we've heard many examples of that. We welcome the introduction of Amatuba learning platform and the reflection on lecturers who have started to use the platform and who really gave us initial indications about how valuable the platform is and the potential innovation that could come in that space. The Open Access Project drew to our attention the multiple knowledges in higher education and the importance of these to solve the world's most critical problems, and the role of libraries in making resources available, sharing resources. And what I really took away from that was just how much more awareness there needs to be about the potential of open resources that are available. So that in summary was just kind of some of my takeaway points for, what the conference was about and where we are now. And I'm sure you have lots more to add to that. So I would appreciate, or we would appreciate, the continuing dialogue around that. But I really want to, from here, ask, well, where do we go from here? Because this is critically important as we move forward. And so when we think even about the Teaching and Learning Conference, is it an event? Is it something that happens? We all have this time to engage, and then we go away and we come back next year and then we re-engage? Or is it something that we can see as an ongoing process, and how we continue to build the opportunities for this engagement so that we feel that the learning community continues to be strengthened, and how we actually build on what we have. And one of the points that we were reminded of, and something that we must think about as we continue to create the platforms for engagement, are around inclusivity and equity. And if we think about who's in the room, but also who still needs to be in the room, or who chooses not to be in the room, are points that are critical for us to think about. So for example, having a conference where the majority of students actually can't participate because of timing and that it being exam period, I think says to us that we perhaps need to think about it again and to find ways in which students can engage actively in this conference. We also need to think about who else is in our space, in our everyday spaces, that are involved in the Teaching and Learning project, either directly or indirectly. So for example, We have the campus protection services, people who are involved in the maintenance and upkeep of our buildings, people who play a key role in residence life. And many of the people are not in the room as part of the conference. And so we need to think about how we engage more inclusively, but also with intention to be equitable. In other words, not to just have people in the room, but to really take seriously the different voices and how they see the future of education. We need representation from marginalized communities, and that's certainly something we have to give more thought to. We also know that there are academic staff who continue to participate in the teaching and learning conference space, and yet there are many more who don't participate. And perhaps to reflect more critically, to engage with, what are the different ways in which people find value in participating, and perhaps the formats need to change, or perhaps we also experiencing a resistance to change. And so in many ways, the people who have participated are really very invested in teaching and learning. But I think to engage the broader community is important. So who else should we include as we deliberate on public higher education is certainly something that we'll continue to consider. Sorry about that. So the next point is really about the purpose of the conference. And as we said, and my question really is around, should we be more deliberate and intentional as we think about conferences moving forward, or platforms for engagement? So maybe we don't even call it a conference. And when we talked yesterday, on Tuesday, we were talking about the D School and the wonderful design space, etc. So I'm just wondering and thinking out aloud that perhaps in future we could have a very different format conference where the entire conference happens in a design format, so that we really engage actively and create something collaboratively that we say is an outcome of the teaching and learning conference. So just something to think about as we think about, what we do moving forward. I also think that it would be helpful for us to keep or to have focused themes, but also to have a conference that has resolutions that it can carry through. I almost feel sometimes that we do all the hard work, but we can't really contribute to decision-making about how we democratize the academic project. And perhaps that's also something important that we can think about. Could the conference become a different space for making decisions in teaching and learning? Although we have committees, etc., I think it's not as inclusive as we'd like it to be. And so how do we engage broader community participation in decision-making is important for us. So I was thinking about, for example, our assessment policy, challenging Anglo-normativity, for example, in practice, and using that as a innovation space to talk about principles, practices, implementation, so that our actions can be more purposeful and intentional, and we feel that we've made some progress in how we implement change. I think many people feel the frustration with the struggle to implement change and how we create institutional processes that support such changes. So I think for me, how we move forward is really important. And I think we have a community of practice that is growing, and with a criticality that is really inspiring. And so in closing, I think I'd like to maybe just reflect on the notion that education is a practice of freedom. And this is a quote that was offered by Bell Hooks. And I'm wondering, as we move forward as a UCT community, how we give meaning to this will perhaps be a measure of our success. And so with that, I conclude this conference, and I look forward to ongoing engagements with everyone. Thank you.